Okay, this lecture is the first about developmental psychology, and in particular, this lecture is going to be on our cognitive development. So, this is really how we develop so many of our cognitive abilities, which includes our ability to solve problems, to be able to remember, to be able to perceive the world, to be able to understand and produce language. So, we don't start off with all of the cognitive abilities that we end up having as adults. And so this is really kind of an overview about how we begin to develop those capabilities from early childhood through adolescence. So after this lecture, what I hope you'll know is some developmental milestones for infants. So just really starting very, very early on in our life, there's very, very early experiences as well as early milestones that can be indicators for how we develop later on. I hope that you'll be able to identify and describe the main areas of cognitive development, be able to describe major theories of cognitive development and what distinguishes them. In particular, I'm going to focus on one theory of cognitive development, which is Piaget. Understand how nature and nurture work together. Understand why continuous development is sometimes viewed as discontinuous and sometimes as continuous. And then some ways in which research on cognitive development is being used to improve education. So just an overview, we'll start by returning to the idea of nature versus nurture. I want to review early brain development, infant developmental milestones, talk about continuous versus discontinuous development. In the order of the lecture, that's going to come after Piaget's theory, which is kind of a main focus of this lecture. And then I'll end with educational applications. Okay, so as we learned about last week, when we talk about nature, what we're referring to is our genes or what we inherit from our parents, the traits that we inherit from our parents. Whereas nurture refers to the environment that development occurs in. And so nurture can be prenatal conditions, thinking about what a mother's diet, the stress that the mother's under. So that would be an environmental condition that can shape development at the very, very earliest stages. But we can also think about the environment that a child is then born into. So the presence of parents versus not, socioeconomic class, right, being rich versus being poor, access to education, healthcare, all of these things would go into the environment. And another idea from last week that I want to bring into talking about development is the concept of gene by environment interaction. The idea is that our genes create a readiness or a predisposition for certain things, but they ultimately get expressed differently depending on the environment that we're exposed to. So here's one example of how genes can affect environment and environment can in fact affect development. So if we look at something that is genetically determined, we could look at an infant's physical attractiveness as well as their temperament. A temperament is, you can think of it as the very earliest signs of a child's personality. And there's pretty strong evidence that temperament is something that is genetically determined just because you see differences in babies from the very earliest stages. So some babies are calm, other babies are fussy. These are things that I'll actually discuss in the next lecture, but there's strong reason to believe that there is a heritable genetic basis for temperament. And of course we know that there is for attractiveness, that is what a child looks like. So these traits that are genetically determined are certainly influenced by genes, but it's also the case that they can influence parenting. So, research shows that parents provide more sensitive as well as affectionate care to children that are both easygoing and attractive as compared to more difficult children or to less attractive ones. This treatment from the parent can then contribute to an infant's later cognitive development. So, how much time a parent spends with their child and the types of stimuli that they expose their child to greatly influences early brain development, which can then manifest even in the childhood, uh, early childhood education. So those things that are genetically uh, determined can influence parenting, which can then influence um, cognitive development. But of course, children play a role as well, and so certainly there's a child's environment, and parents are a major part of that child's development. But children make their own choices. So yes, it's true that a parent can expose a child to books and to reading, but as a child matures and develops, they can make their own choices and decisions about how much they want to read, how much they want to read on their own, how much they want to study, what they like to read. So, as a child develops from their very early years until to the later years, they become more involved with making their own choices and decisions, and so they can end up shaping their own cognitive development through their own choices. So it's all kind of like not totally predetermined by genes. It's not predetermined by parenting. This is to say that even though those are major influences, um, everybody, all children, as they grow up and as they age, they're a factor as well. Okay. So parents make choices and children make choices. There we go. All right. So just in terms of just thinking about our anatomy and our brain, as infants and children develop, their brains change in a couple ways. The first is that axons form synapses with other neurons. Recall from last week that neurons communicate to each other by passing an electrical signal through an axon, release of chemicals across a synapse, which then bind to another neuron. So we don't have those synapses formed with neurons. Those are actually formed in the process of development and learning. Interestingly, by age 4, a child's brain is about 80% that of an adult. So a child's brain size increases due to myelination, which is forming that fatty layer on the axon, as well as developing new synaptic connections among neurons, particularly in the frontal lobe. So um, by age 4, you can see just how important it is to think about a child's early experiences, their early development, their environment, whether they're being exposed to stimuli, whether they're getting proper nutrition, because 80% the child's brain is 80% the size of an adult by the time that they're 4, and so in those early years, children's brains are furiously developing those synaptic connections. It turns out that we grow more connections than we ever use, but this growth gives us the ability to change and to adapt to our environments. Synaptic connections also change, though. So the connections that we don't use actually decay and disappear, and this is through something called pruning, which is not a bad thing at all because it actually leads to more efficiency in the way that our brain operates. Some connections grow stronger. So if you think about those different connections between neurons in terms of things that are associated in our brains, it really enhances our ability to remember important things by having some synapses that are stronger and others that kind of disappear or go away for something that we've learned that is no longer used or no longer important. You'll see this green bolded underlined text. There's a hyperlink here. This is something that I share in Canvas. Um, I'll be sharing many videos throughout this lecture. My best recommendation is to potentially watch this lecture in Canvas as an embedded video, then go ahead and pause it. So you might like pause it now and then just click on this link. And so that'll kind of give you the additional information um, in the flow of the lecture. So that's how I recommend to view this. It is the case, unfortunately, that some children just aren't raised in environments that stimulate their brains. And this is important because fewer synaptic connections are made, and that means less ability to solve problems or to develop more advanced language skills. Um, and then the reverse is true, of course. When infants and young children are able to explore their environments, when they're given opportunities to move and to talk and to read, their brains are stimulated. So, early childhood education really, uh, folks that go into that field can't stress enough the importance of um, providing children with a sufficient amount of stimulation in those early years, because those very early years, from infancy through preschool age, that's when our brain does the majority of its growing, and it really sets the basis for then where kids are starting off in kindergarten. And a big reason why you see so many differences between children in terms of their preparedness for formal education starting in kindergarten is because of the early childhood experiences before that. Okay, so what do children start out with in life? Turns out that babies come into the world hardwired with some basic motor reflexes that aid their survival. So babies need to eat in order to grow, and so they're born with these innate, which means unlearned. Innate means you come into the world with it. Um, innate unlearned reflexes that help them find food. So, for instance, when infants are stroked at the corner of the mouth, they show a rooting reflex, and they turn and open their mouth in anticipation of food, which of course means that if they find a nipple from mother, they'll then show a sucking reflex. And then a third inborn innate ability, this reflex, is a grasping reflex. So if you touch an infant's palm, they'll automatically curl their fingers around the stroked area. And the idea that some scholars have is that this is a survival mechanism that persists from our prehistoric ancestors. So young primates need to be carried from place to place, and so grasping onto their mothers is an adaptive reflex. So if you have the ability to be around a little baby, just go ahead and give that a try. You'll notice that when you offer your finger, they grasp right around it. I'm noticing that with my own 4-month-old, and infants have surprisingly strong grips for that reason. So this slide shows the average age of motor skill acquisition. Okay, and so when we talk about a child maturing, we're talking about the physical development of the brain as well as the body that prepares an infant for voluntary movement. So the early reflexes that an infant has helps the infant survive in the first months of life, but being able to move on their own is kind of another matter. Babies have to learn these motor skills. So these are not necessarily innate abilities. These motor skills must be learned. So for instance, if you've been around a newborn baby, or if you've just seen them on TV or on the movies, But you might see a newborn baby trying to lift its head and look around, and you'll see that it just has this wobbly head. It can't control its head. Its neck muscles just aren't um, strong yet. So it takes a lot of practice for a baby to be able to move its head in a slow and controlled manner when they recognize a voice. Okay, so that's a learned skill. Also, in the first years of life, babies go from being able to move their head to then sitting up to then being able to stand and walk. Now, here's an interesting thing. It was originally thought that this process of maturation was entirely determined by nature and not nurture. That we see these milestones, and it was just kind of thought that, yes, this is just our genes expressing themselves, that everybody has this innate ability, and that you'll see this progression of ability. But we know that that's not the case. We know that nurture plays a very strong role too, because we see that some infants skip over certain steps due to what they're exposed to by their parents. So, for instance, some infants skip crawling altogether. This happens when infants sleep primarily on their back. They end up not developing their stomach muscles, which they need to crawl. So that's just one example of if you have parents that make sure that the child sleeps on their back, or they often will place them in like a bouncer or a chair or something like that, and they don't give their child the ability to develop stomach muscles, sometimes the kid won't crawl. So it's a good example of how an environment and what is in that environment, namely choices made by a parent, affects um, motor skill acquisition. Okay, so senses develop as well. So certainly infants are born into the world with some perceptual abilities, but not all. And so this is important when we think about cognitive development, because in order to learn anything, we get our information through our senses. So at birth, some senses are more fully developed than others. Taste is a sense that develops very early. So apparently, researchers have been able to determine that infants as young as 2 hours old, just 2 hours old, prefer sweet tastes to all other tastes. This could be because breast milk is sweet, and so there's this innate built-in preference for liking sweet versus other tastes. But it shows that we're pretty much born with the ability to taste. Infants also have a good sense of smell. This has also been studied. It's found that infants will turn their head toward a pad that contains their mother's milk, but not pads containing milk from other breastfeeding mothers. So there's something distinct about the smell of one's own mother and that milk, and that's something that is developed very early on. It also turns out that when infants are born, they can hear pretty well. Again, if you've ever been around a little baby, you'll notice that they startle at loud sounds, and they'll turn their heads in the direction of everyday sounds, and in particular, the voice of a parent. By just 6 months, infants have hearing that is just as good as adults. And often, children have much better hearing than older adults because as you age, that degrades. Um, the sense that is not great in infants is vision. Newborns have pretty poor vision. Initially, they can only see about 8 to 12 inches in front of their face, and they can't see differences in color. They can see high contrast patterns. So you'll notice these babies on this play mat and the big, bold geometric shapes and patterns. That's because babies can see that stuff, and they can only see about 12 feet in front of them. Also, before 2 months, they really can't see color. It's only after 2 months that they can start to see blue and red and green. So you'll notice that a lot of stuff that's made for infants will often be black and white and these high contrast patterns. Gradually, The ability to see improves over the first 6 months, and by about the age of 1, a little baby can see about this same as adults. Okay, so just to make the point that we come into the world with a lot of our senses, which is of course important because that's the way that we learn things at a very early age. Um, but vision is one of those things that is not well developed, and there could be some evolutionary um, explanation for that. Is that for the most part, our prehistoric kind of ancestors of primates and then developing is what a baby needed to do is recognize mom's nipple, and so that they can see only so far, and only high contrast means that they're able to focus in on mom and particularly find that source of food. Okay, so infants end up taking a big step in their cognitive development when they are able to understand who they are. We know that infants have the ability to know who they are when they can recognize themselves in a mirror. This is called the mirror self-recognition test, and I've made a link right there, and I've placed the link in Canvas if you want to check that out. Once infants become self-aware enough to recognize themselves in a mirror, they can learn that their thoughts are different from other people, and this is called theory of mind, which is the ability to understand that other people have their own minds and their own intentions. Whether or not a child has developed theory of mind is tested with something called the false belief test. Okay, so I've included another video there that illustrates um, kind of a task that allows a researcher to understand whether a child has developed theory of mind. So go ahead and check that out. Um, what the video will show you is that kids don't end up developing a theory of mind until around 4. Some recent research does suggest that very young children, even as young as a year and a half old, can understand the intentions of others. Um, so there isn't yet consensus around the number, but we can say somewhere between a year and a half and 4 years, most children will develop a theory of mind in which they have the ability to understand that other people have their own minds, their own thoughts, and their own intentions. And this is important because understanding that other people have minds and intentions of their own is associated with the ability to start to think in increasingly sophisticated ways. So check those 2 videos out if you haven't yet done that. All right, so what I'm going to move to now is Piaget's theory of cognitive development. This is one of the most influential theories of cognitive development. It was proposed by a Swiss psychologist named Jean Piaget. So he's the first psychologist who's credited with doing systematic research, systematic observations of how children acquired knowledge and their understanding. So he's thought by many people to have been really the major person to develop developmental psychology. And so based on the results of his observations, really of his own children as well as his neighbors' children, he proposed that children's thinking progresses through a series of 4 discrete stages. I'll just show you all of them. So by a stage, what he meant was that there's a period during which a child thinks similarly about the world, okay? That they think in a similar way about different types of problems. These stages, according to the theory, occur in a fixed order. So that is, stage 1 happens before stage 2, which happens before stage 3, happens before stage 4. And that a child's thinking within each of these stages is fundamentally different. Okay, so I'll describe each one of these in detail, but stage 1 is sensorimotor, goes from birth to 2. Stage 2 is preoperational. It goes from round 2 to 6 or 7 years old. Third stage is concrete operational. That's from 6 or 7 years old to 11 or 12. And then formal operational, which is from around 11 or 12 years old throughout the rest of one's life. All right, so let me go into detail about each one of these stages. So the first stage is the sensorimotor stage. Again, this is from birth to about 2 years old. During this stage, children understand the world through their senses. It's through their perception and through their interaction with the physical world. So Piaget said that this stage is really characterized by intelligence in action. It's the child interacting with the environment and by manipulating physical objects. So during this stage, the child's thinking is largely based on their interaction with the physical environment. Their mental representations of the world are very limited. So a good example of this is Piaget's object permanent task. Object permanence is the understanding that an object continues to exist even when it can't be seen or heard or touched in any way. Okay? So an infant or a child has object permanence when they know that something exists even though they can't see it. But there's at least some evidence that this is an ability that develops. So for instance, if an infant who is younger than 9 months of age is playing with their toy, and then another person takes that toy and puts it under a blanket and doesn't let the infant immediately reach for it, the infant is not likely to try and go after that toy, to try to get it back. And according to Piaget, doesn't show any emotional distress. And the reason is not because they no longer care about the toy or that they're unable to reach for it. It's just they don't understand that it's there, that it's under the blanket, because they can't see it. Because they can't see it, it fails to exist. Okay? And that's true because if you just take that same toy and you put it under some sort of like a clear covering, something like plastic or something like that, they'll reach for the toy. So it's not being able to see it means it doesn't exist. That's the idea of object permanence. And so what Piaget said is that children don't develop this ability or this understanding of object permanence until about 9 months. Now, in more recent years, this has been challenged by studies suggesting that infants much younger do have a clear sense of when objects exist. And some research has shown that object permanence will show up at about 3 months. Okay? But we can say that somewhere between 3 months and 9 months, object permanence, the ability to recognize that just because you can't see an object doesn't mean it disappeared, that is something that develops. And that would be a characteristic of moving past stage 1. Okay, there's others, but one feature of moving past stage 1 is developing object permanence. So after the sensorimotor stage, children move on to the preoperational stage. And so this is from about 2 years old to 6 or 7. So according to Piaget, during this preoperational stage, children acquire object permanence, which again they get after about 9 months. And they also begin to show a wide variety of other abilities. Okay, they show a capacity to represent the world in symbols. Okay, symbolic representation, such as being able to draw things, being able to use language. However, a 2 to 7-year-old tends to focus on single dimensions when solving problems that would require them to consider multiple dimensions. And so this is evident in Piaget's conservation problems. So conservation problems are problems that Piaget created in which there's some physical transformation of an object in a way that is very perceptually different or obvious, even though the original quantity or amount of the original object doesn't change. So the best known example is done with a glass of water, as you see, two glasses of water, as you see pictured here. The water, the juice, is moved from one glass to another glass, typically one that is taller and more slender. And so even though it's the same amount of liquid, it looks very perceptually different. Um, children that children that are below the age of 7 say that there's now more water than before because they focus on a single dimension, which is the height of the glass. What you're going to see in this link is this little child who is going through a series of these conservation problems. One is with water, I think another is with a ball of clay or Play-Doh, another is with a set of coins. And you're going to see that he hasn't quite mastered conservation of quantity, and there's several very interesting examples there. And he's just absolutely adorable to watch and listen to. So again, children fail at the conservation of quantity task because they just focus on a single dimension, like how tall the glass of water is, and they use that single dimension, height, as their basis for making a judgment. And they ignore the changes in the other dimensions, like that the glass has gotten more narrow. As children move into the concrete operation stage, which they do from about 7 to 11 or 12, they can overcome this error and they can start to consider multiple dimensions. And so when children are in stage 3, they're able to recognize that there's the same amount of liquid in glass A as there is in C. Just because they're different shapes, it's the same amount of liquid. You know, if you just move it over, it doesn't change anything about the amount. Hence the name conservation. The actual quantity is conserved. It looks different. Okay, so children can start to think in these multiple dimensions as to say, oh, well, it looks different because that the glass is taller, but it's also more narrow, 2 dimensions. And what you're going to see in this link, which again is in Canvas, is a little child who's a little bit older than the first little child who clearly has conservation of quantity mastered. It is the case, though, according to Piaget at least, that when children are in stage 3, they still can't think like adults and they can't quite think scientifically. So they can think in terms of multiple dimensions or multiple variables, but their thinking is still somewhat flawed. So, for instance, one of the problems that Piaget used and that other researchers have used are these pendulum problems, where they ask children to play with a pendulum and to try to come up with their theory about what affects the arc of the pendulum. Okay, so when you create a pendulum, you hang, basically, you can hang a string on the end, you put something like a ball, and you can take it and you can just pull it back and then let it swing back and forth. So the question is, what are the factors that affect how quickly that pendulum will swing back and forth? Well, there's all kinds of variables. There's the length of this, what's called an arm. There's the weight of the ball. There's the angle that you pull it back. There's all kinds of things. So you can do little experiments and you can try to test out all the different factors that affect that arm of the pendulum. What Piaget said is that most children who are in this stage end up performing biased experiments. So they come up with their idea. They might say, for example, I think that the main thing that affects the pendulum is the size of the the weight that's attached. So I'm just going to put a heavy weight on it, and then, oh, look what happens. There's um, there's a wider arc. See, I'm correct. So what Piaget said is that they end up doing these biased experiments that basically test their original idea, and then they believe their original idea is correct without really going through kind of a scientific process of testing out all the possibilities. Okay, so at this stage, they start to develop more sophisticated thinking, but they still can't quite think as in an advanced kind of scientific way like an adult can. It's not until children reach the very final stage of development, the formal operations period, that they can kind of reach this reasoning power of mature adults. And so they can end up solving the pendulum problem in a wide variety of other problems. But it's really at this stage that we can start to think in abstract thoughts. Um, so we can use symbols to represent other things. We can also start to engage in thoughts about our thoughts. This is called metacognition. So, for example, the idea that I know that I know certain things, but I also know that I might not be correct in what I know. So this is knowledge about your knowledge, or a thought about your thought. So this is more advanced things that we start to develop from the time that we're 12 through adulthood. However, this formal operation stage tends not to occur without exposure to formal education in scientific reasoning, and it tends to be largely or completely absent from people that never went through formal education, or even among societies of people that don't have this type of education. So one specific ability that is developed in this stage is deductive reasoning. So deductive reasoning, also known as deductive logic, is the process of reasoning from one or more statements, known as premises, to reach a logical conclusion. The idea here is that if you start with a premise, and that premise is true, and then you follow the rules of deductive logic, then the conclusion that is reached must necessarily be true. So what you'll see here in this video is two different children. One is quite young, the other is a little bit older, so like a preteen or a teen. And you'll see the difference in their ability to engage in deductive reasoning. The person that is the researcher gives both children a set of statements. The first, and basically the set of, sorry if this is a spoiler, but the set of statements goes something like this. If you hit a glass with a feather, the glass will break. The person hit the glass with a feather. What happened to the glass? Okay. Now we know that if you hit a glass with a feather, the glass won't break. It's a feather. A glass is strong. A feather can't break the glass. However, if you say, hey, here's the rules. The rule is, if you hit a glass with the feather, the glass will break. Okay? Somebody that is 12 or older that can engage in these abstractions, that can say, I know that that is physically not possible, but we're talking about like an abstract thing. It's an abstract rule. That's fine. I'll believe it. I can then follow the process of deductive reasoning, and I know what the conclusion must be based on these statements. So that's something that is an ability that develops over time. Younger children can't do that because they're still stuck in the concrete phase, where they think in very concrete, as in non-abstract terms, and they say to themselves, but a feather can't break a glass, so I don't know what you're talking about. Okay, so anyway, there's some, you'll see good examples of that ability to either not think in abstraction versus just think in abstraction from those two children. And thinking in abstractions is a very important capacity that really needs to be developed. And if you think about many of our sciences, especially when you start getting into physics, even when you start to get into biology and chemistry, there's just many things that um, we can't see, at least with the regular eyesight or the naked eye. And so we need to be able to think in abstractions in order to understand the world. And so that's developed in stage 4. So overall, here's the evaluation of Piaget's theory. First, it's been hugely influential. We can say that this was really the start to developmental psychology. He was one of the first to systematically study children, and so he's credited with being a prominent figure in really starting this field. His theory is taught in nearly every Psych 101 class, so it's had that influence. These original ideas have inspired generations of other psychologists to study children. And the main method that he used, which you'll see in those videos, is the clinical interview, which is to ask children to explain what they're thinking. So this is still a technique that's being used today. This theory has also been extremely influential in determining educational policies as well as teaching practices. So in terms of an applied use, it's been very influential in education. So despite the influence of the theory, it hasn't gone without its criticism. So for instance, more recent scholars have obtained research findings indicating that cognitive development is considerably more continuous than Piaget claimed. And so to understand the difference between continuous versus discontinuous development, we'll take a look on the next, well, I'll just go here now. We can think of continuous development as kind of being like a tree growing. There's kind of if you chop down a tree and you look at the rings, each of those rings marks a period of growth or a year of growth. But pretty much the tree is just going from that sapling to a mature tree, and it's just this very gradual and progressive change along the way. Stage models, on the other hand, or Piaget's model, is more associated with discontinuous development, where you've got a period of little to no growth, and then this rapid increase or change, and then what is happening at the next stage looks not at all like the stage before. So we see that the development of a ladybug could be characterized as discontinuous, where there's these stages of growth, and what the ladybug looks like at each stage doesn't at all resemble the previous. So if you think about Piaget's four theories, his theory is a model of discontinuous development. Is that children can pretty much they have abilities during these periods or these stages, and then there's some rapid change in their ability, and then they're on to the next stage. Well, theorists have said it's not really like that. Development is more continuous and gradual. It doesn't happen in stages. So that's one big critique of his theory. Another criticism is that progression to the 4th stage is not necessarily guaranteed. So that's this formal operational stage. So some research has shown that quite a few, as in 40 to 60% of college students, fail at many formal operational tasks like deductive reasoning. Other research has said that only about 1/3 of adults ever reach the formal operational stage as proposed by Piaget. So that's a big thing. It's like quite a few people don't get to this stage 4. Another criticism is that competence is not performance. So let me explain. Piaget measured ability by giving children these tasks and these problems to solve, and then he made conclusions about whether children have the ability by how they perform on the task. Well, how you perform on a task is not exactly the same as having the ability. So for instance, let's go back to the object permanence idea, this idea that the object continues to exist even though you can't see it. So a child might have object permanence. That is, they have the competence, even though they don't, say, search for it or reach for the object, which is the performance. So it's really difficult to study children, especially children that are not yet verbal, because you have to observe what they do and then make some assumptions. So the assumption is that if the child doesn't reach for it, they must not think it exists, and therefore they have not developed object permanence. But maybe they do, and they're just not reaching for it. So um, that's part of the critique, and that's the same critique that can be applied to many of the tasks that he had children do, is that he's measuring performance. It's not the exact same thing as just whether a child is competent or has the ability. Okay, another critique is that Piaget proposed that children go through this fixed set of stages from stage 1 to 4. They go through the same progression. There's the age milestones, right? 0 to 2, 2 to 7, 7 to 12, 12 to adulthood. But, and that's basically the same for everyone. But children's experiences matter a lot. And so children develop these different abilities. Some develop much earlier on, some develop much later on, and it has to do with their parents, their home environment, what they're exposed to, what they're not exposed to. So Piaget really was more on the nature side of things, and he thought that there was a biological basis for the development of these abilities. What he failed to recognize was the nurture side, or what he didn't recognize enough, or at least write about enough, was the nurture side of it. And then finally, there are some pretty significant cultural differences in the development of some of these abilities. So just as a couple examples, in Mexico, there are the children of pottery makers that know that reshaping clay doesn't change the amount of clay that there is. And they're much better than at that conservation of quantity task when clay is used than other kids are, because of their cultural experience seeing clay being worked with. So they show conservation of quantity much earlier on, particularly when clay is used. Other research has done studies in remote parts of the Australian desert with Aborigines. And so research that has studied 18 to 14-year-old Aborigines has given them conservation of liquid tasks as well as spatial awareness tasks. He found that the ability to this ability to have conservation of quantity came later in Aborigine children. Okay, so usually like around 10 to 13, as opposed to between 5 and 7, as with Piaget's sample. However, he found that spatial awareness, so being able to locate things in space, distance, etc., developed early or earlier among Aborigine children than with Piaget's children. And so what this shows is that cognitive development is very much reliant on cultural factors as well. In this case, because spatial awareness is crucial for nomadic groups of people. So that's developed earlier. Going back to the question of continuous versus discontinuous development, what is it? Do we develop more like the tree graphic, or do we develop more like the ladybug? I think the reasonable answer seems to be it depends on how much we observe children and how often we look. So development is much more likely to be viewed as continuous to the extent that we're observing our child on several different types of abilities all the time. I think in contrast, development sometimes looks discontinuous I've often found myself remarking, "When did you learn that?" Or "I can't believe you know how to do that already," simply because I don't have the opportunity to interact with my son every single hour of the day on every single kind of thing that he's into, whether that's school related or his hobbies. Um, I'm tempted to believe that development is very continuous, but it often looks discontinuous to us, or like these stages, simply because we don't have the opportunity to observe our children on a regular basis. All right, let's shift to kind of a big shift, but we're going to shift to applications to education, and just kind of two things that have to do with reading and then with math. But these are presented in the module, and I'm going to present them as well because it illustrates some interaction of both nature and nurture, and thinking about how children develop and how they interact with their environment has some very important real world practical benefits. So one really good example of the role of nurture is found in reading. And so particularly understanding the role that phonemic awareness has for reading. Phonemic awareness is the awareness of component sounds within words. So, for example, we can take the word cat and we can say, what are the sounds? There's a k sound, there's a sound, and there's a t sound. So those are the phonemes in the word cat. And so there's something like, I'll probably get this wrong, but like 28 different phonemes, like 28 different unique sounds in the English language. And it's all the combination of phonemes that create all the words in the English language. And so teaching kids about phonemes and about the basic building blocks of sounds that go together to produce words, and basically working on phonics, is the way the kids learn to read. So this phonemic awareness typically happens in kindergarten in the first grade. It can be done with simple rhyming tasks, matching words with the beginning of sounds, all this kind of stuff. It turns out that kindergartners' performance on phonics tasks is a strong predictor of reading achievement in the third and the fourth grade, and it's an even stronger predictor than their general IQ or social class background. So the short of it is, if you want to be able to get a kid to read and read at grade level, you teach them phonics. And research has even gone on to show that teaching skills to 4 and 5-year-old kids, they end up doing better on reading achievement tests years later. So phonics are really important. Teaching these phonemes is important because, that's what it is. Even there's 26 letters, but there's 40 different sound units. There's 40 different phonemes, and there's many difficult examples. We know with the English language, there's stuff that just doesn't make sense at all. For instance, this is a really good example. This is a fun book. P is for pterodactyl. It just shows all the counter examples in the English language of why sounds are often unexpected. So anyway, this is an example of nurture because the ability to read and phonemic awareness is an ability that needs to be taught. And so if we have to think about in terms of our cognitive abilities and developing different cognitive abilities, this would be a very kind of far on the nurture side of the continuum. What's very unfortunate is that many schools don't understand the importance of phonics. I don't know if you remember how you learned to read, but learning phonics has very, very strong scientific support for the way that children learn to read. Unfortunately, it isn't always being taught. So this article from NPR, and there's a 5-minute audio clip that goes with it, is a story about how different school districts were teaching reading and how many of them were just simply teaching reading wrong. And so in recent years, there's been this movement towards helping students read by trying to understand the story and use context. And so one of the things that is encouraged is that when kids are reading, if they get to a word that they don't know, rather than sound it out using phonics and phonemes, is to look at a picture or to think about the context of the story and then make a guess, right? So that the most important thing for a child to do is to understand the meaning of the story and not necessarily the exact words on the page. So, like, if a kid comes to a word horse and says house, the teacher would say, uh, you know, that's wrong because a horse is not a house. But if the kid instead of saying horse says pony, it'd be okay because pony and horse mean the same thing. But one, pony and horse are not the same thing, and two, horse and pony in terms of the words don't look anything alike. So um, encouraging kids to read in this way by looking at pictures and to think about context, it turns out, while well intended, it can actually not be so great for teaching children how to read. So the big takeaway of research, and one thing that I hope that you'll know, is that reading is not a natural process. We're not necessarily kind of wired to read from birth. It needs to be something that is learned, and that we become skilled readers by thinking about each word as a code that needs to be cracked, and that each word has the sound elements that need to be put together in a code. So, all right, so there's that. Now, when it comes to math, um, there's uh, there's research that shows that activities like playing numerical board games can improve mathematical ability. So one that's been used in particular is Chutes and Ladders. This game requires a child to use dice. There's numbered spaces. Playing this game has been shown to improve children's understanding of numerical magnitudes, which is the size of numbers. And this research came about because several researchers noticed that even before kindergarten, kids from poor backgrounds show much less math ability than kids from affluent backgrounds. So how do you close that gap? Well, the hypothesis was that the difference in these early childhood math abilities might be due to children who are in middle or upper income families engaging more frequently with numbers and with numerical activities, for example, by playing board games that have these numbers. So what research did was had kids play Chutes and Ladders and other numerical board games for about an hour over a period, an hour a day over a 2-week period, and it showed that children from low-income families were able to do much better on assessments of their numerical ability after having played these games. And the good thing about that is that the gains that they got from playing the games lasted for months after they played. So it works because the game teaches children about numbers, because when you roll the dice, you the more numbers on a dice, the further the distance that you move your character. So it's a very simple way in order for children to learn the basics of numbers and numerical magnitude. I think the last point that I want to make is that our brains continue to develop through adolescence. So the prefrontal cortex, which you learned about last week, is particularly involved with things like planning, problem solving, um, and as we're developing our synaptic connections, this is where the majority of those synaptic connections are going to be made through adolescence. Um, so when we're first born, most of our gray matter, which is the body of our neurons, is really in the uh, primary sensorimotor cortex, and it's not until we mature that our prefrontal cortex matures. So early on, our limbic, meaning when we're younger, the thing that kind of grows first or that is the most evolved is our limbic system, which controls emotion and reward. Um, and, and we don't quite yet have that prefrontal cortex that is associated with problem solving and planning. So, what does it mean about young kids? It means that they're emotional and often impulsive and don't yet have the ability to solve problems on their own, to think ahead, to plan. Um, so, for those of you that want to go into early childhood education, for those of you that are parents, I think it is instructive to think about this is that it's not really until adolescence that prefrontal cortex is fully developed. And so, um, we can kind of only expect so much of kids. So when kids act out or act impulsively, some of that might have to do with um, still developing their ability to regulate emotion, to be able to think of consequences, to, like what will happen to me in the future if I do this thing now. So I think that that's helpful to know. All right, so I think that that was all I wanted to share for today. I hope you've learned a lot about the way that our cognitive abilities develop. Thank you for watching.